One of the significant recent contributions to the debate over Jesus' resurrection comes to us from the acclaimed New Testament scholar Dale Allison through his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History. My inclusion of Allison in a discussion of skeptics may seem anomalous, inasmuch as Allison describes himself as a Protestant Christian. Allison's orthodoxy has been the subject of considerable disagreement among other Christians, with some accepting him as such and others denying this. But my purpose in this video is not to weigh in on that debate. I have included a discussion of his work on the subject since, despite describing himself as a Christian, his book is very skeptical of apologetic efforts to show that Jesus was raised beyond all reasonable doubt. And while he also criticizes skeptics who think that the resurrection can be shown to have not occurred, his book has been hailed by many of them as one of the best refutations of apologetic arguments for the resurrection. Thus, because of the significance which Allison's work is deemed to have for the resurrection debate, it merits some discussion in this video. Frankly, it's a bit odd reading Allison's book as someone who defends a maximalist argument for the resurrection of Jesus. I noted near the beginning of this video how there are broadly two approaches to defending the resurrection, minimalism and maximalism, which correspond to two different ways of approaching the Gospels. The maximalist approach considers the Gospels as holistic sources of information and tries to assess the credibility of these sources by attempting to link them to the original apostles. Allison has drunk deeply of the cup of bad habits which permeate modern New Testament studies. Among those bad habits is the rejection of approaching sources as unified wholes, the overall reliability of which can be assessed as such. Instead, he buys into the assumption that the Gospels are mixtures of both history and legend. So the task of the New Testament scholar is to try to determine which parts of the narrative can be relied upon and which parts cannot. This way of treating the Gospels is completely different than how they are treated in my argument. In many ways, Allison's book is a great catalog which demonstrates the many problems which plague contemporary New Testament studies, as the plethora of logical fallacies which are so deeply entrenched within this discipline are on full display. For example, when discussing the appearance of the resurrected Jesus to Mary Magdalene, Allison suggests that John's account may be dependent upon Matthew's account, and if this is so, Allison claims, then Matthew must be the only source for this appearance, and John can be discounted as being an independent source. As he says, the issue is John, which a few take to be dependent exclusively on Matthew. If John does nothing but rewrite Matthew, then the latter would be our sole source for Mary's Christophany. The problem is that it simply does not follow that literary dependence precludes the having of independent sources of information. It is entirely possible that the author of the fourth Gospel should have depended upon Matthew's Gospel literarily and still also had independent access to additional sources of information. Allison likewise concludes that the presence of apologetic glosses within the Gospels licenses the inference that the apologetically significant material is fictional. But obviously a detail can be included in a narrative both because it is apologetically useful and also because it is historical. Arguably, the former depends upon the latter. Similarly, Allison concludes that Matthew's story of the saints rising in Jerusalem is certainly not historical. He refers to it in other writings as a fiction and as a tall tale. How does he know this? According to him, this is because no other sources report it. As he says, Wright's half-hearted argument arrives at no firm conclusion. In historical terms, there is no way of finding out whether Matthew's little story mirrors an event of the past. My verdict is different. We can be almost pontifical here. Matthew 27:51-53 recounts a miracle unsurpassed anywhere else in the Gospels or other books of the Christian scriptures. Indeed, if it happened, it is the most amazing event of all time. But it did not happen. The astounding series of prodigies has left no trace in the other Gospels, Acts, Paul, Josephus, or, for that matter, any other pre-Matthean source. It stands alone, half a century or more after the incredible events it reports. The key problem here is that this is a blatant argument from silence, and as I explained in my video, Were the Gospels Originally Anonymous? Arguments from silence are seriously problematic. We simply have far too many examples of ancient sources remaining silent with respect to significant events which we independently know to have occurred. At the very least, this should cause us to be wary about concluding with any confidence that an event did not occur simply because there is silence about it. Allison is aware that he is making an argument from silence, but he protests that some arguments from silence are nevertheless valid. He asserts, while this is, to be sure, an argument from silence, some arguments from silence have force. Allison is correct that not all arguments from silence are equal. Some carry more force than others. However, they only carry force when some fact or facts about the silent source generates the expectation that the silent source would have mentioned the event if it had occurred. Unfortunately for Allison, it's fairly easy to think of a reason why Mark, Luke, and John wouldn't have included the story of the raising of the saints. It's not directly relevant to Jesus' story. It's not a miracle which Jesus performed. And since the Gospels are primarily focused upon telling Jesus' story, it's not at all surprising that they wouldn't have included it. Furthermore, it's not even necessarily true that Matthew is the only source which mentions the resurrection of the saints. The Odes of Solomon certainly appears to describe such an event. This work shows no signs of dependence upon the Synoptic Gospels, and it does not connect the resurrection of the saints with any of the other events to which Matthew relates it, such as an earthquake and the tearing of the temple veil. The work is also typically dated to the later 1st or early 2nd century, which makes it a possible candidate for an early and independent source testifying to the resurrection of the saints. As Jake O'Connell observes, hence, although the odes do not actually mention appearances of the resurrected saints, they do at least attest to the fact that people were raised from the dead around the time of Jesus' death. But in any case, it's not clear why Allison thinks that we would have so much additional evidence for the resurrection of the saints. He seems to think that this event involved hundreds of individuals returning to life and publicly presenting themselves to the whole of Jerusalem. But nothing within Matthew's Gospel suggests that it was anything like this. He leaves the entire matter quite vague. For all we know, it only involved half a dozen saints appearing to people who were already believers. Indeed, the number of saints would have had to have been relatively small. Matthew says that they emerged from their tombs. But we must remember that when a Jewish person died, they were not laid in a tomb permanently. They were only left in the tomb until their flesh decomposed, at which time they were moved to an ossuary. So the total number of saints in tombs at this time would have had to have been fairly small. Again, O'Connell is correct when he says, "This objection loses its force once we realize that the event was not as spectacular as it initially seems. There is no evidence that the appearances were public appearances. The assumption of scholars such as Allison seems to be that the resurrected saints appeared to huge crowds, which included neutral and hostile witnesses, such as Pilate and Caiaphas. If this was the case, one would certainly expect the event to be widely attested. But in fact, there is nothing in the text which indicates the appearances were like this. We are only told that the resurrected saints appeared to many, and it may be that these appearances, like the resurrection appearances, occurred primarily to those who were already followers of Jesus. In this case, the appearances would have no more apologetic value than the resurrection appearances themselves. I highlight these points to illustrate why it's somewhat difficult for me as a maximalist to engage with Allison on the resurrection of Jesus. We are simply approaching the matter in two very different ways. Allison's methodology presupposes that my way of approaching the Gospels is incorrect. But because this is a presupposition, he does not directly argue against my way of approaching the Gospels. As such, the vast majority of his 400-page book is simply not applicable to my argument for the resurrection. Our starting points are just so radically different that we would have to engage in a deeper debate pertaining to our overarching methodologies before we could have a substantive debate over the particulars. With all that being said, Allison does offer some very brief comments on the resurrection arguments of Timothy and Lydia McGrew, as well as of Jake O'Connell. Since my argument for the resurrection is broadly within the same family, I will take some space to consider Allison's criticisms of the McGrews and O'Connell. Regarding O'Connell, Allison writes, O'Connell, in order to arrive at odds of 1,000,000,000 to 1 in favor of Jesus' resurrection, needs to establish that the Gospels are generally reliable. This task involves defending the historicity of the resurrection of saints in Matthew 27 and ironing out even minor discrepancies among the Gospels. Not only will his argument sway none save those already swayed, but one is puzzled as to why anyone who swallows the camel of Matthew 27 with its resurrection of many should strain at the gnat of Mark 16 with its resurrection of one. Indeed, the Gospels are so steadfastly factual for O'Connell that one wonders why he needs anything more. If all the relevant texts are literally true down to their details, the orthodox conclusion would seem to be inevitable. There are 2 points of clarification which need to be made here. The first is that Allison seems to have misunderstood O'Connell. The maximalist argument asserts that the Gospels faithfully represent what the eyewitnesses claim to have seen. It does not, as Allison seems to think, assert that the Gospels are factual in every respect. I have made this point extremely clear in the third premise of my argument, where I explicitly say that it is possible that the testimony is deliberately false or honestly mistaken. By leaving open those possibilities, I do not presuppose the factuality of the testimony. The truth of that testimony remains to be revealed by the excluding of those other possibilities. This distinction is critical because it is in virtue of this that maximalist arguments for the resurrection are not question-begging, as Allison implies. The second point is that Allison seems to have misunderstood O'Connell's purpose in defending the plausibility of the rising of the saints in Matthew. The point is not to establish that this actually happened. The point is to undercut the idea proffered by scholars like Allison that it is just absurd to believe that this event could have happened. If Matthew made it up, then we would have reason to question the thesis that Matthew's gospel represents a faithful account of what the original eyewitnesses claim to have seen. O'Connell is trying to take that objection off the table, and so he defends the rationality of believing that this event might have happened. This is all that the maximalist needs to defend. Allison is guilty of a very serious misunderstanding of the maximalist case for the resurrection, and his critique of O'Connell puts that misunderstanding on full display. Regarding the McGrews, Allison writes, "As for the McGrews, they presume the detailed facticity of Luke 24:36-43, where the risen Jesus eats fish, and John 20:24 through 29, where Jesus shows himself to doubting Thomas, narratives whose historicity many, including everyone who disbelieves in the resurrection of Jesus, query. Perhaps it would be instructive were someone to apply Bayes' theorem to other astonishing religious claims. What would happen were a Tibetan Buddhist to run the numbers for this or that master achieving rainbow body? I cannot begin to guess what such exercises might yield, or even how they might be conducted. But the lack of a comparative yardstick arguments my hesitation regarding the efficacy of Bayesian analyses of Jesus' resurrection. Once again, we see the same misunderstanding. Timothy and Lydia McGrew are clear in their Blackwell article, which Allison is discussing, and elsewhere, that they are not presupposing the historical factuality of the text, but rather just that it corresponds to what the original witnesses claimed. In their Blackwell article, they say in no uncertain terms, where the texts do assert something miraculous, for example, Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, we take it, given the basic assumption of authenticity, that the narrative represents what someone relatively close to the situation claimed. And elsewhere, Lydia McGrew has said, this argument is not question-begging, since it is a statement about what the alleged witnesses claimed. Their testimony with this content must then be explained. I think that the McGrews have been more than clear that their argument assumes only that the Gospels accurately relay what the apostles claimed. It does not assume that what the apostles claimed, and so what the Gospels report, is necessarily truthful. And they have offered numerous arguments for why they think that the Gospels are trustworthy on this front. I don't claim that Allison is doing this deliberately, but yet again, we see that he has some fairly serious misunderstandings regarding the structure and nuances of the Maximalist case for the resurrection. As for his statement about rainbow bodies, his mentioning them gives me an opportunity to discuss what some might regard as one of Allison's more unique contributions to the resurrection debate. Allison claims that the evidence for the Buddhist phenomenon of so-called rainbow bodies is comparable to the evidence for the resurrection. It is a somewhat common strategy in replying to resurrection arguments that some other religion has miracles which are attested as well or better. Rainbow bodies are Allison's preferred example, as he goes on for the entirety of chapter 12 of his book, explaining why, if you think that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is rationally compelling, then you should similarly find yourself rationally compelled to believe in rainbow bodies. The phenomenon of rainbow bodies involves a body, typically after death, rapidly shrinking or dissolving over a period of days until it disappears. This is supposed to indicate that one has achieved a profound state or level of spiritual realization. Allison believes that this example should give Christian apologists pause to think. As he explains, what would follow if every single one of the stories from Tibet is a hagiographical fabrication or the product of pious hocus pocus? A Christian, wanting to defend the uniqueness of Jesus' resurrection, might think this the obvious view to back. Yet to my mind, the apologist should here be ill at ease. Would not rejection of all the non-Christian stories reinforce the skeptic's repeated insistence that religious sincerity and eyewitness testimony do not ensure historical truth? If Tibetan bodies never mysteriously dissipate in a few days, but rather, against the multiple testimonies, some of it indisputably first-hand, invariably succumb to the usual phases of biological decay, then some must be, if not liars, then deluded victims of someone's misperception or trickery. And surely the more examples of such delusion and or deceit surrounding dead bodies that one can amass, the more confident skeptics will be in rejecting the testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the example of rainbow bodies is by no means a special case. Skeptics have appealed to a large number of cases which are supposedly comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. Certain Catholic miracles tend to feature prominently in such discussions. There are always 2 points to make in response to these sorts of arguments, which apply to Allison's example of rainbow bodies as well. The first is that not all miracles are equal in terms of what they can establish. Not all miracles confirm the truth of the religions in which they may occur. There is no reason to suppose that the Christian God, for example, could not miraculously heal the child of Muslim parents. Just because the miracle happened within a Muslim family, it does not therefore confirm Islam. So we have to distinguish between miracles which corroborate doctrines and miracles which do not. The defender of Jesus' resurrection does not need to reject every last miracle in every other religion. He just needs to show that Jesus' resurrection can support Christian doctrines. And since Jesus said that his resurrection would be the one sign that his teachings were true, that's pretty easy to establish. The defender of Jesus' resurrection would probably want to contest any miracles which would corroborate doctrines which conflict with Christianity. However, it's not immediately clear how the phenomenon of rainbow bodies would conflict with any doctrines of Christianity. So the Christian may not have to reject this phenomenon in order to retain his Christian beliefs. Ultimately, we should be concerned with the evidence. If the evidence for another miracle is as good as the evidence for the resurrection, and if the evidence for the resurrection warrants belief, then Christians should believe in other miracles with comparable evidence. This will only create a problem if the other miracle is in conflict with Christianity. As a second point, and probably more importantly, the evidence for these other miracles actually needs to be on par with the evidence for the resurrection if the critic is to have an argument. And here is where I maintain that Allison's example of rainbow bodies is not comparable to the resurrection. In the first place, I don't agree with Allison that we are dealing with multiple attestation. He gives 3 examples of this phenomenon in his book, but in each case, they are reported by just one source. In one instance, the source claims that 3 Tibetan monks could corroborate the story, but in this case, the 3 monks only saw the shrinking body as it lay covered by a blanket. So while they assumed that what they saw was a body, they did not actually confirm this. Consequently, it's quite easy to see how they could have been deceived. In addition to a lack of multiple attestation to any particular instance of a rainbow body, we don't have comparable grounds for thinking that any of the witnesses would not have lied in this case. This phenomenon of rainbow bodies is perfectly acceptable within Buddhist communities, and so, unlike the apostles when they proclaimed the resurrection, the witnesses in these cases were not opening themselves up to a serious threat of persecution and death for the most part. Furthermore, as I have already indicated, it's often easy to see how the witnesses could have been honestly mistaken, as with the 3 witnesses who presumed that they were seeing a body shrink underneath a blanket. But the situation is very different when it comes to the apostles. The resurrection is multiply attested. Persecution and martyrdom were real threats which the disciples faced for proclaiming it, and it is not at all easy to see how the disciples might have been mistaken about the resurrection, given what they tell us about what the appearances of Jesus were like. So the Christian need feel no guilt over being inconsistent when simply rejecting reports about rainbow bodies as cases of lies or as cases of being honestly mistaken, because these reports are not comparable to the reports about the resurrection, as Lydia McGrew explains.
They're not comparable. They're not similar. That's the question, is whether they're comparable or similar. So let me talk a little bit about how they're not comparable or similar. How difficult in the things that he quotes and cites as evidence would it be to be mistaken? And for some of the people whose accounts we have, to just be mistaken. Now, it might be that somebody else is carrying out a fraud, but in that case, we don't know who they are or whether anybody knew who they were and whether they got in any trouble for it or whatever. And for many rainbow body claims and for many of the people, not that hard. He has this very strange quotation concerning the Dalai Lama, who believes that someone achieved rainbow body. He is the Dalai Lama. He furthermore knows firsthand some of the witnesses involved, witnesses who handed him physical evidence related to the alleged event. You want to know what the physical evidence is? A piece of a robe. Okay, so the Dalai Lama talked to a couple disciples of one of the Buddhists who supposedly achieved rainbow body. They appear not to have gotten into trouble for doing this, and they meet the Dalai Lama and they say, yeah, our master achieved rainbow body, and they hand him a piece of cloth. This is a joke. This is like a bad epistemological joke. If I said that my husband flew around the house yesterday and I handed you a shoe and I said, and this was the shoe he was wearing, that shoe proves nothing. That's not physical evidence related to the event. What are you talking about? It's a piece of cloth. It could be from somebody's robe. It could even be from that master's robe. That is no evidential vector at all to support their claim beyond the claim itself. Ridiculous. They handed him physical evidence related to the alleged event. I mean, if the Dalai Lama thought, wow, ooh, you handed me a piece of his robe, then, Allison has this other talk about how the Dalai Lama is incredulous. Well, if he thought the piece of the robe was epistemologically relevant, that's pretty darned credulous. All right. Or there was one case where they were coming in every day after the person died, and there was this robe covering his body completely to begin with. And then people would come in and they believed that it looked like the object under the robe, which was presumed, Allison says, to be the body, was getting smaller each day. And the object's under the robe. We don't know what they're presuming to be the body. This reminds me of the origins of Mormonism, where Joseph Smith wouldn't let the other so-called witnesses even see the alleged golden plates. He said he'd been told he'd be killed if he showed them. So he had these metal plates of some kind wrapped up in his tunic. And they said they saw them with the eyes of the spirit. So it's like object under a robe. Okay. Or to come in and say that the body was gone later. So they would open the room after 7 days and the body was gone. Okay, so maybe the body was gone. But to be mistaken about whether it turned into a rainbow, that's very easy. There was even a relative of one of these whose uncle had died. And he thought that his uncle's body was getting smaller. So he's like sitting by the corpse and he's like, it looks smaller to me. Now, we don't know how much smaller or what. And this guy actually did suffer persecution. He contacted the newspapers and he wanted the journalists to come and he wanted measurements to be made of his uncle's body. The communists weren't happy about this. He was thrown in prison. I don't know for how long. But then the body was burned, was cremated. So this nephew's already in a religious tradition where they believe that bodies disappear and turn into rainbows. Again, this is not establishing a whole new idea like the disciples of Jesus were. And there's one of those older apologists that shrewdly says that it's much easier to support an existing religion by allegations of miracles within that religious context than it is to establish a new set of religious ideas by within a hostile context by an allegation of a miracle. And it's completely true. So this guy already believes that they turn into rainbows, and he thinks that his uncle may be achieving the rainbow body because the body looks somewhat smaller. Well, I mean, it's very subjective. And then, it was never carried out. So he could have been sincere. Okay. And then there's one where there are some guards. They've thrown the living Buddhist master himself into prison. And he's there. I think they guarded him for like a year. And then eventually they come in to the room and they find nothing. Well, first of all, the claim is they came into the room and they found his body shrunk to the size of he was dead, and his body shrunk to the size of a child. Like, was it just curled up? Or did someone else add that to the story? There can be religious embellishments of stories, okay? I don't deny that there are religious embellishments of stories. I just argue that that's not happening in the case of the resurrection claims, and I'm prepared to argue for that. And then later they come in, and there's just a robe and some hair and some nails. I might add that as far as I know, no one did DNA testing to see if they were that guy's hair and nails, and even if they were, you could take them off the corpse and you could leave them there with the rope. So, who knows, what happened to that body, but I don't think it turned into a rainbow. Sorry if you just think that's a theological prejudice, but the point is that this would be, if the guards were impressed, this would be something they could easily be mistaken about, that it really turned into a rainbow. Okay, so a lot of that is interpretation. And sometimes even the alleged data itself is something that someone could just be mistaken about, like, oh, my uncle's body looks like it's something smaller. Okay, and then I've sort of anticipated this a little bit, but the question of faking. If all we had, in the case of Jesus, were the empty tomb, we'd have a much weaker case. It would still have, some evidential force, but it would be a much weaker case. Not something you would go out and, I think, reasonably die for, commit your life for. Not something I would commit my life for if all we had was, his body disappeared. In the case of the disciples, I contend that what we have is that these people are saying, we were with him, we met with him, we ate with him, we were able to touch him after he rose from the dead, after he had been dead, and then he met with us in a group. That's not the kind of thing you can be mistaken about. Allison is not even presenting that. Okay, these are claims that people could have interpreted as somebody turning into a rainbow that was just the body being missing, or that people who faked don't seem to have suffered a serious fate. Okay, and that would actually be, not all that hard to fake, put some object under a robe, and then you put a smaller object under the robe the next day and so forth. Pretty easy to fake. Or going and meeting the Dalai Lama and handing him a piece of cloth. I mean, that's not impressive. It's just astonishing to me that Allison makes a big deal about these things. Now, he also makes a big deal about how recent it is. He seems to think that the fact that something happened in the or allegedly happened in the 20th century, or was alleged in the 20th century, or even the early 21st century, should be extremely exciting. Not in and of itself. I mean, I imagine there are people out there credulously believing miracles today. So I hope this has given you some idea of the nature of the differences between the cases.
To summarize, while Allison's book does discuss a lot of the literature surrounding the resurrection, I think it fails to provide any reason to seriously shake the apologist's confidence in the historical case for Jesus' resurrection. Allison's approach is hampered by the problematic way in which he approaches the Gospels. He has, unfortunately, and seemingly uncritically, accepted most of the assumptions and methods inherent within contemporary New Testament studies, but nowhere offers a defense of those assumptions or methods. We have seen that Allison's criticism of the Maximalist approach to the resurrection pretty flagrantly misunderstands it. And lastly, I have argued that his favorite counterexample to the case for the resurrection, namely rainbow bodies, are not analogous to the resurrection with respect to the quality of evidence which supports them. Allison has become something of a darling of both several apologists and counter-apologists. He is praised by many on both sides as a refreshing beacon of honesty, The reason for this, I suspect, is that Allison comes to very middle of the road conclusions. He defends aspects of both the apologetic and skeptical approaches to the resurrection. But I would suggest that there is a very important distinction between being moderate and being honest. It seems to me that many people on both sides have mistaken Allison's moderation for a sign of honesty. This is not to suggest that I think that Allison is dishonest or anything like that, but it is to suggest that Allison is subject to the exact same biases and methodological blunders as anyone else. And while his book certainly deserves to be widely read, it also deserves as much criticism and critique as any other book on this subject. Mike Licona reminds us, even humility can be employed immoderately, resulting in agnosticism that forfeits itself against mounting evidence that threatens it.